What if one of the most powerful substances affecting your brain isn't an illegal drug, isn't alcohol, and isn't even something most people think of as dangerous anymore? What if it's sitting in your pocket right now? A vape, a nicotine pouch, a cigarette, or perhaps a device that delivers nicotine dozens or even hundreds of times per day without you fully realizing it? And what if I told you that nicotine is one of the most misunderstood compounds in neuroscience? Many people assume nicotine is the primary reason smoking causes cancer. Others believe vaping is essentially harmless. Some people even view nicotine as a cognitive enhancer that improves focus, memory, and productivity without significant consequences. The reality is far more complex, and understanding that complexity can dramatically change how you think about nicotine, addiction, brain health, metabolism, and long-term longevity. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Nicotine is an incredibly potent neuroactive substance. Within seconds of entering the bloodstream, it reaches the brain and binds to specialized receptors called nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. These receptors play important roles in attention, learning, memory, motivation, mood regulation, and cognitive performance. When nicotine activates these receptors, the brain releases dopamine, and dopamine is often misunderstood. Dopamine is not simply the molecule of pleasure, it's the molecule of motivation, the molecule that tells the brain, pay attention, this matters, do this again. That's one reason nicotine can feel so powerful. It temporarily enhances alertness, it can increase focus, it can improve reaction time, and it can create a sense of mental energy. But there is a cost, because every time the brain receives nicotine, it begins adapting. Receptors change, reward circuits change, behavior changes. Over time, what started as a choice can become a biological need. And that's where addiction begins. What the research shows is that nicotine is among the most addictive substances humans commonly consume, not because it creates intense intoxication, but because it efficiently hijacks the brain's learning and reward systems. The brain learns nicotine equals relief, nicotine equals focus, nicotine equals reward, nicotine equals stress reduction, and eventually those associations become deeply embedded. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine your brain's motivation system is a microphone. Normally, important experiences gradually increase the volume. Achievement, exercise, learning, connection, progress. But nicotine artificially turns the volume knob up very quickly. The problem is that over time, the brain compensates by lowering the baseline volume. As a result, normal life can start feeling less stimulating without nicotine. This is why quitting can feel difficult. It's not simply breaking a habit, it's allowing the brain's reward system to recalibrate. In today's discussion, we're going to explore exactly how nicotine affects the brain and body. We'll discuss the neuroscience of addiction, the effects of smoking and vaping on cardiovascular health, metabolism, hormones, and cognitive performance. We'll separate myths from evidence, and most importantly, we'll cover science-based strategies that can dramatically improve your chances of quitting successfully. Now, let's begin with the most important question. Why does nicotine feel so powerful? Why can a single cigarette, vape hit, or nicotine pouch create a feeling of focus, alertness, motivation, or even calmness within minutes? The answer lies in the brain's communication system. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Your brain contains billions of neurons communicating through chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. One of the most important of these is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine plays critical roles in attention, learning, memory formation, reaction time, and cognitive performance. Nicotine happens to mimic acetylcholine. When nicotine enters the brain, it binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. These receptors are located throughout areas involved in attention, learning, reward, mood regulation, and motivation. The moment nicotine activates those receptors, a cascade of neurological events begins. Dopamine increases, norepinephrine increases, acetylcholine signaling changes, certain brain networks become more active. As a result, many people experience heightened alertness and concentration. What the research shows is that nicotine can temporarily improve aspects of attention and vigilance, especially in individuals who are sleep-deprived, cognitively fatigued, or already nicotine-dependent. This explains why some people report feeling more productive after using nicotine. But here's where things become complicated. The perceived enhancement is often partly due to relief from nicotine withdrawal itself. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine wearing a backpack that gradually becomes heavier throughout the day. At some point, removing the backpack feels amazing. But you're not actually stronger than before, you're simply removing a burden. For many regular nicotine users, the feeling of improved focus comes partly from eliminating withdrawal symptoms that have begun developing since the last nicotine exposure. The brain isn't necessarily performing above baseline. It's often returning temporarily toward baseline. This distinction is extremely important. Now let's discuss dopamine. Dopamine is frequently called the pleasure chemical, but that's not entirely accurate. Dopamine is primarily involved in motivation, pursuit, reinforcement, and learning. It teaches the brain what behaviors are worth repeating. Every time nicotine causes dopamine release, the brain learns something important. This behavior matters. Remember this. Do it again. Over time, powerful neural associations begin forming. Morning coffee becomes linked with nicotine. Driving becomes linked with nicotine. Stress becomes linked with nicotine. Social situations become linked with nicotine. Work breaks become linked with nicotine. Eventually, these environmental cues alone can trigger cravings. The brain starts anticipating nicotine before nicotine even arrives. This is one reason addiction becomes so persistent. The habit is no longer just chemical, it's neurological, it's behavioral, it's environmental. Now let's discuss receptor adaptation. The brain constantly seeks balance. When nicotine repeatedly stimulates nicotinic receptors, the brain adapts by altering receptor density and sensitivity. This process is called neuroadaptation. Over time, more nicotine may be required to produce the same effect. And when nicotine is absent, the altered system produces withdrawal symptoms. This is where dependence begins. The brain gradually starts treating nicotine as something necessary rather than optional. Now let's move beyond the brain and talk about the rest of the body. Because one of the biggest misconceptions about nicotine is that its effects are limited to addiction and cravings. In reality, nicotine influences nearly every major physiological system: the cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, the metabolic system, the nervous system, and ultimately, long-term health and longevity. Here's what's really going on inside your body. The moment nicotine enters the bloodstream, the body interprets it as a signal to activate the sympathetic nervous system. This is commonly known as the fight-or-flight system. Your body prepares for action. Heart rate increases, blood pressure rises. Blood vessels constrict, stress hormones are released, energy becomes mobilized. From an evolutionary perspective, these responses were designed for short-term survival situations, running from danger, responding to threats, performing intense physical activity. The problem is that nicotine can trigger these responses repeatedly throughout the day. What the research shows is that chronic nicotine exposure can place significant strain on the cardiovascular system. Even though nicotine itself is not the primary carcinogen in cigarettes, it contributes to elevated blood pressure, increased heart rate, vascular dysfunction, and increased cardiovascular risk over time. This is particularly important because cardiovascular disease remains one of the leading causes of death worldwide. Now let's discuss metabolism. Many people believe nicotine helps them stay lean, and there is some physiological truth behind that observation. Nicotine can modestly increase metabolic rate. It can suppress appetite, and it can influence energy expenditure. But these effects come with significant trade-offs. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine trying to heat your home by constantly revving a car engine inside the garage. You might generate more heat temporarily, but you're creating damage at the same time. Nicotine may slightly increase calorie burning, but it does so by activating stress pathways that were never designed to remain chronically elevated. In other words, it's not a sustainable metabolic strategy. Now let's talk about hormones. Nicotine affects cortisol, one of the body's primary stress hormones. Frequent nicotine exposure often leads to repeated cortisol elevations throughout the day. Initially, some people feel more energized, more alert, more focused. But over time, chronic stress activation can contribute to sleep disturbances, mood instability, recovery challenges, and metabolic dysfunction. Research also suggests nicotine can influence reproductive hormones. In both men and women, chronic smoking has been associated with hormonal disruptions that may affect fertility, reproductive health, and overall endocrine balance. Another important consideration is sleep. Many nicotine users underestimate how significantly nicotine can affect sleep quality. Because nicotine is a stimulant. Even when people fall asleep without difficulty, nicotine can reduce sleep efficiency, increase nighttime awakenings, and impair restorative sleep architecture. And poor sleep creates a vicious cycle. Fatigue increases, cravings increase, stress increases, and nicotine use often increases as a result. Now let's discuss longevity. One of the most remarkable findings in health research is that many of the benefits of quitting begin almost immediately. Heart rate improves, Blood pressure begins normalizing, circulation improves, inflammation decreases, and long-term disease risk starts moving in a healthier direction. The body has an extraordinary capacity for recovery when nicotine exposure stops. Now let's discuss the question that millions of people ask themselves every year. If I know nicotine is harming me, why is it so hard to stop? The answer is not weakness, it's not a lack of discipline, and it's certainly not a character flaw. The answer lies in the way nicotine reshapes the brain's learning and reward systems. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Every behavior your brain repeats frequently becomes more efficient. This is one of the brain's greatest strengths. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, drive cars, build habits, and automate daily routines. Unfortunately, addiction uses the exact same biological machinery. Nicotine is exceptionally effective at activating neural pathways involved in learning and reinforcement. Every dose delivers a clear message to the brain. This behavior is important. Remember it. Repeat it. Over time, these messages become deeply embedded. The brain begins anticipating nicotine before it arrives, and that's where cravings begin. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine walking through a forest. The first time you travel through it, there's no path. You have to push through branches and vegetation. But if you walk the same route every day, eventually a trail forms. Weeks later, the path becomes obvious. Months later, it becomes the easiest route to follow. Addiction works similarly. Every nicotine exposure strengthens a neural pathway. The pathway becomes easier to activate. The behavior becomes more automatic. Eventually, reaching for nicotine can occur with very little conscious thought. Now let's discuss cues. One of the most powerful discoveries in addiction neuroscience is that the brain doesn't only respond to nicotine itself, it responds to everything associated with nicotine. Morning coffee, driving, work breaks, social gatherings, stressful meetings, alcohol, certain friends, specific locations, even particular times of day. These cues become linked with dopamine release through a process called associative learning. Over time, the cue itself begins triggering anticipation. The brain starts preparing for nicotine before nicotine is actually consumed. This is why cravings can feel so sudden and powerful. The environment is activating learned neural pathways. Now let's discuss withdrawal. Many people fear withdrawal because they assume it's evidence that their body needs nicotine. But that's not what's happening. Withdrawal is actually evidence that the brain is adapting to the absence of nicotine. What the research shows is that nicotine withdrawal commonly includes irritability, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, anxiety, increased appetite, mood changes, sleep disturbances, strong cravings. These symptoms occur because the brain is recalibrating its reward systems. Remember the volume knob analogy from earlier. Nicotine artificially increases stimulation. When nicotine is removed, the brain temporarily operates below its normal baseline until adaptation occurs. During that adjustment period, everyday experiences may feel less rewarding. Motivation may decrease, focus may feel harder, but this state is temporary, and that's a critical point. The brain is remarkably plastic. Given enough time, dopamine systems begin recovering. Receptor activity normalizes. Natural rewards become satisfying again. Energy stabilizes, and cravings gradually weaken. Now let's address one of the most important questions in modern nicotine research. Is vaping actually safer than smoking? And what about nicotine pouches, nicotine gum, patches, or other nicotine delivery systems? The answer requires nuance because not all nicotine products carry the same risks. But none of them are completely risk-free. Here's what's really going on inside your body. When scientists evaluate nicotine products, they separate two different issues: the effects of nicotine itself and the effects of the delivery system. This distinction is critical. Cigarette smoking remains one of the most harmful forms of nicotine consumption because tobacco combustion creates thousands of chemicals. Many of these chemicals are toxic, many are carcinogenic, and many contribute directly to cardiovascular disease, lung disease, cancer, and premature mortality. In other words, much of smoking's danger comes from the smoke itself, not just the nicotine. What the research shows is that cigarette smoke contains carbon monoxide, tar, oxidizing compounds, heavy metals, and numerous cancer-causing chemicals. These substances damage blood vessels, lungs, DNA, and cellular function throughout the body. This is why smoking remains one of the leading preventable causes of death worldwide. Now let's discuss vaping. Vaping eliminates combustion, and from a toxic exposure standpoint, that generally reduces exposure to many harmful chemicals found in cigarette smoke. However, reduced harm does not mean harmless. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine jumping from a 10-story building versus a 3-story building. The three-story fall may be less dangerous, but it is certainly not safe. Similarly, vaping may expose users to fewer toxic combustion products than cigarettes, but it still exposes the lungs and body to substances that can affect health. Research continues to investigate the long-term consequences of chronic vaping because widespread use is relatively recent compared with decades of smoking research. Current evidence suggests vaping can contribute to airway irritation, inflammation, vascular dysfunction, and ongoing nicotine dependence. Now let's discuss nicotine pouches. Products such as nicotine pouches avoid both smoke and vapor exposure. As a result, they may eliminate some of the respiratory risks associated with smoking and vaping. However, the nicotine itself still reaches the bloodstream and brain. The effects on dopamine systems remain. The effects on blood pressure remain. The effects on addiction pathways remain. In other words, changing the delivery system does not eliminate nicotine dependence. It simply changes how nicotine enters the body. Now let's discuss nicotine replacement therapy. Products such as nicotine patches, gum, lozenges, and inhalers were specifically designed to help people quit. One major advantage is that they provide nicotine more slowly than cigarettes or vapes, and speed matters. The faster a substance reaches the brain, the stronger its addictive potential tends to be. A cigarette can deliver nicotine to the brain within seconds. A nicotine patch delivers it gradually over hours. This slower delivery often reduces reinforcement and makes quitting more manageable. What the research shows is that nicotine replacement therapies can significantly improve quit rates when used appropriately, particularly when combined with behavioral support. Now, here's the most important takeaway. If the goal is maximizing health, longevity, cardiovascular function, brain health, and overall well-being, complete nicotine cessation remains the ideal outcome. While some delivery systems may be less harmful than others, none are entirely free from physiological consequences. And understanding those differences helps people make informed decisions rather than relying on myths or marketing claims. Now let's discuss the question that matters most. How do you actually quit nicotine successfully? Not theoretically, not someday. But in the real world, where cravings are powerful, habits are deeply ingrained, and stress can trigger relapse unexpectedly. The good news is that modern neuroscience provides valuable insights into what works and what doesn't. Here's what's really going on inside your body. When people try to quit nicotine, they often focus exclusively on willpower. They believe success depends on being mentally strong enough to resist cravings. But what the research shows is that successful quitting is usually much more strategic than heroic. The most successful quitters don't simply fight cravings. They change the environment that creates them. Remember from earlier that nicotine addiction isn't only chemical, it's neurological, behavioral, environmental, and emotional. This means quitting requires addressing all four components. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine trying to stop a river by blocking only one stream. Even if you block that stream successfully, water continues flowing through multiple channels. Nicotine addiction works the same way. The chemical dependence is one channel, habits are another, environmental triggers are another, stress management is another. To maximize success, all channels must be addressed. Now let's discuss the first science-based strategy. Identify your nicotine triggers. For most people, cravings aren't random. They're linked to specific situations. Morning coffee, driving, work breaks, stress, social events, alcohol, certain locations. The goal is to create awareness. For 1 week, write down every nicotine craving. What time did it occur? What were you doing? What were you feeling? Patterns quickly emerge, and once you identify triggers, you can begin disrupting them. Now let's discuss replacement behaviors. The brain dislikes behavioral vacuums. If you remove nicotine without replacing the behavior, cravings often intensify. This is why simple substitutions can be surprisingly powerful. Walking for 5 minutes, drinking water, breathing exercises, chewing sugar-free gum, brief exercise, calling a friend. The goal isn't distraction. The goal is creating a new neural pathway, a new response to the trigger. Now let's discuss nicotine replacement therapy. What the research shows is that nicotine patches, gum, lozenges, and similar therapies can significantly increase quit success rates. These tools reduce withdrawal intensity while allowing the brain to gradually adapt. Importantly, they separate nicotine from the behavioral rituals associated with smoking or vaping. This often makes the quitting process more manageable. Now let's talk about exercise. Exercise is one of the most underappreciated tools for smoking cessation. Why? Because exercise increases dopamine naturally. It improves mood, reduces stress, enhances cognitive function, and helps regulate cravings. Even short walks can produce measurable benefits. Now let's discuss sleep. Many people underestimate the relationship between sleep and relapse. Sleep deprivation increases impulsivity, increases stress, reduces emotional regulation, and often strengthens cravings. Protecting sleep during nicotine cessation may dramatically improve success rates. Finally, let's discuss mindset. Cravings are not evidence that quitting is failing. Cravings are evidence that the brain is healing. Every craving that passes without nicotine weakens an old pathway and strengthens a new one. The discomfort is temporary. The adaptation is permanent. Now, here's the key takeaway. The most effective quitting strategy is not relying on willpower alone. It's combining neuroscience, behavior change, environmental design, sleep, exercise, and evidence-based support into a comprehensive recovery system. Because when you work with your brain instead of fighting against it, quitting becomes far more achievable. As we conclude, let's return to the central idea of today's discussion. Nicotine is far more than a simple habit. It is a powerful neuroactive substance that directly influences the brain's reward system, attention networks, motivation circuits, cardiovascular system, hormones, metabolism, and long-term health. And understanding those effects gives you a tremendous advantage. Today, we explored how nicotine rapidly activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors throughout the brain, increasing dopamine, attention, and motivation. We discussed why nicotine can temporarily improve focus and alertness, but also why those benefits often come at the cost of dependence and adaptation. We examined how nicotine affects the body beyond the brain. Elevated heart rate, increased blood pressure, changes in stress hormones, disruptions in sleep, effects on metabolism and cardiovascular health. And while different delivery systems, cigarettes, vapes, nicotine pouches, gum, and patches carry different levels of risk, none completely eliminate nicotine's impact on the nervous system. We also explored one of the most important concepts in addiction science. Addiction is not a failure of character. It's a process of learning. The brain learns that nicotine is valuable. It creates associations. It builds habits. It strengthens neural pathways. And eventually those pathways become automatic. But here's the encouraging part. The same neuroplasticity that creates addiction can also support recovery. The brain can adapt in both directions. Every time you resist a craving, you're teaching your nervous system something new. Every time you choose a healthier behavior, you're strengthening a different pathway. Every day without nicotine allows your reward system to move closer to its natural baseline. And over time, the brain becomes less dependent on artificial stimulation and more responsive to life's natural rewards. What the research shows is that recovery begins almost immediately. Within days, physiological improvements begin. Within weeks, many people notice better breathing, improved energy, and more stable mood. Within months and years, cardiovascular risk declines substantially, and overall health continues improving. So here's your challenge. For the next 7 days, simply observe your relationship with nicotine. Track every craving, identify every trigger, notice the situations, emotions, locations, and routines that drive the urge to use nicotine. Don't focus on perfection, focus on awareness, because awareness is where lasting change begins. And remember, you don't quit nicotine because you're weak. You quit because you're strong enough to reclaim control over your own biology. If this video added value, like the video and subscribe to join others who are using science-based tools to optimize their health, performance, focus, metabolism, and longevity naturally. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.